Hello and welcome to day 209 of Dungeon 23, the series where we make a room of a mega dungeon every day for a year. Today we're finally going to do the phosphorus sword, the elusive phosphorus sword. But there appears to be a little bit of a snag in that it is lodged in a giant mound of seaweed, and if you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons before, you obviously know what this is, but before we get to it, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more wacky Dungeons shenanigans, and possibly even turn on notifications as well. But with that little tangent out of the way, we're gonna just go directly to our guy here, because as you can see there's two doors here. They're both locked. This one has a DC of 13 and this one has a DC of 15. Pretty basic. But here's our main thing. This mound of seaweed. It is 140 HP. Why would it have HP? Well, because it's a monster, obviously. And it has its little phosphorus sword stuck into its back. 140 HP, 15 AC. This is a shambling mound, although it is altered. Actually quite a bit, I suppose. It is huge instead of large, so it's a size category larger. Its slam attack has a reach of 10 feet, as opposed to 5 feet, so it could reach you further. And it has an engulf ability, and instead of just having one medium or smaller creature, it could engulf up to 3 medium or smaller creatures, or one large creature. Just because like Rune Knight and Enlarge Reduce was a potion that was floating around for a while. And I really like the idea of the party having like cut their way out of the inside of this monster. And the final thing is that if it takes at least 10 cold damage, I was gonna specify a spell of first level or higher, but we'll do cantrips. But whatever. So when it gets hit by a spell or it just takes 10 cold damage, its speed is halved from 20 down to 10, and it has a disadvantage on attack rolls until the end of its next turn, to basically signify that it's like kind of freezing. It's cold, it's getting sluggish, because it's completely submerged in water. It's very, very wet, and it's seaweed, not just normal regular plant material, so it's extra wet. And that's the end of its kind of alterations. What I have down here is basically getting the sword and the actual sword stat block. The sword has more stats than the actual monster, which is funny. So this massive mound of seaweed is actually a sleeping, shambling mound, obviously. Stabbed into its back is the phosphorus sword. A DC 17 strength check is needed to pull the sword from the mound, assuming it is still alive. If the party manages to kill it, then they could just take the sword. No big deal. Now for the actual sword, the thing we've been waiting like a month for. It is a great sword, so it's 2d6 slashing damage. It has the heavy property and two-handed property, obviously. It deals an extra 1d4 fire damage if the target is either wet or submerged in water. So basically everything down here gets an extra d4. Or if you get hit by like a water skin, dumping a water skin on somebody, decanter of endless water, shape water, create destroy water, all that stuff would be super useful. It sheds bright light for 10 feet and dim light for an additional 10 feet. If the sword is submerged in water or wet, again because it's phosphorus, it's going to burn underwater. A creature hit by the weapon must make a DC 14 con save or become vulnerable to fire until the end of its next turn. Sorry, the user's next turn. So if the person using the sword has an access like the firebolt cantrip, they could do a lot of damage. And immunity becomes resistance, and resistance becomes normal damage just because it's chipping it down. On a crit, the sword that would normally do an extra 2d6 slashing damage will now just do an extra 2d6 fire damage. So on a crit, it's going to do 2d6 slashing, 2d6 fire damage, and then if the target's wet, then 2d4 fire damage. So a lot of fire damage if it's a crit. And finally, well, not finally, the final thing is it requires attunement, but that's a given for most magic items. The final big thing here is that on a crit fail, you're basically slamming against things. It's cracking, it's chipping. Phosphorus isn't a very strong material. It is magic, but it's not super structurally sound. So all those little chips and cracks add up, and every time you make a crit fail, it's a -1 to the attack and damage, basically a -1 weapon, and this keeps stacking until it reaches -5, in which case it completely breaks. Very similar to how the black pudding and ochre jelly and basically all of the oozes eat through weapons and stuff like that. And that is basically it. It's a bit of a boss fight, although I do actually plan there to be the final boss fight, which might be a modified clay golem. It's kind of spoiling a little bit, but what I want the final boss to be is like a scuba diver guy, and I think just re-flavoring a clay golem would work best, because I want him to have that haste ability. But yeah, that is basically it for today. As I said before, if you want to see more, then consider liking the video, commenting down below, subscribing to the channel, all the algorithm stuff, so that way these appear in your recommendations more often. Or you can just come back tomorrow. It's a daily series. You know, it's day 209. It's going to keep going. And yeah, thanks for watching and or listening. I apologize for the poor quality. It's not going to improve.